Hi, Michelle Glass here. Welcome to our first episode of our Chapter 15 lecture series. Our job here in Chapter 15 is just to begin looking at the connections between information traveling from the body to the spinal cord up to the brain for processing, and then we'll do the reverse of that. So our next video is looking at what are called descending tracts, which is how information from the brain is traveling down the spinal cord and then out to the body. So we're beginning to connect things together. Now, as we talk about ascending tracts, the term ascending, of course, means going up. So that can help us to remember that this is the sensory information traveling up to the brain for processing. Our term tract has a very specific definition. Remember, it is a bundle of myelinated axons that are carrying the same type of information in the same direction at about the same speed. So as we are looking at each of our tracts, we do need to pay attention to exactly what type of information is traveling. So we have to go a little bit beyond whether it's just sensory or motor and know specifically what type of sensory information. Obviously, these are all traveling up, but we need to know where is that final processing center going to be located. And because the right brain is controlling the left side of the body and vice versa, we need to pay attention to when this information is going to cross from one side of the body to the next, and that crossing over is called decussation. So we're paying attention to exactly what type of information is traveling, where is decussation occurring. It's usually either the spinal cord or the brainstem, and then where is that final processing center. As we talk about ascending tracts, we are talking about sensory information, and we're going to be focusing in specifically on general sense information. So general senses are those sensations that are collected by specialized receptor cells or maybe even free nerve endings. So there's not a complicated anatomical structure involved in the collection of a general sense. Pain is collected by special cells called nociceptors. Temperature is collected by thermoreceptors. Pressure is detected by baroreceptors or baroceptors. And touch is collected by tactile receptors. Now we're going to be talking about fine touch and crude touch in our conversations. Fine touch is described in our text as that detailed touch that allows you to read Braille, so able to kind of not just identify that the surface is bumpy, but it's bumpy in a particular pattern, whereas crude touch is more like the sensations you're getting from, maybe your arm or your back of your body. So we're not really detecting a lot of detail. We just know it's bumpy. And then the final one is called proprioception, and this is detected by proprioceptors, which are located in your synovial joints and tendons and ligaments, looking at essentially the position of your body in space. For each of our ascending tracts, we are going to see that they're located in the white matter of the spinal cord. And so one of our jobs is to pay attention to where they're located, and very often that's how they're named. So this first pathway that we're looking at is called the posterior column pathway. So it's that whole back portion of the spinal cord. And our posterior column pathway is where our fine touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioception information is traveling. So what we're going to see is that sensory information is collected by special receptor cell, and that cell is synapsing onto what we call the first order sensory neuron. This is the neuron that is taking that information to the spinal cord. So of course it's traveling in through that posterior root, and it's coming into the back portion, the posterior gray horn of our spinal cord, and then it's going to, in this case, travel up that posterior column pathway, where it's then going to synapse onto a second order sensory neuron at the brainstem, and it's going to be the job of the second order sensory neuron to decussate or cross from one side to the next. The second order sensory neuron is taking that information onto the thalamus, where it synapses onto our third order sensory neuron. Our third order sensory neuron, by definition, is housed in the thalamus, so we can also call it our thalamic neuron. The thalamus, remember, is our relay center. So it's going to be directing this information on to what is called the primary somatosensory cortex. The primary somatosensory cortex, remember, is located in the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe. And so that is the processing center for a good portion of our general sense information that we're consciously aware of, okay? All right, our next one is called the posterior spinocerebellar tract, and we also have an anterior spinocerebellar tract, and we're not going to actually differentiate between these two, so we can sort of collectively call them the spinocerebellar tracts. Now, the name here, spinocerebellar, tells us that we're going to start in the spinal cord and then end at the cerebellum, so that's how we're getting our name here. In this case, we're going to have information from our muscles and our tendons and our joints, primarily that proprioception information being picked up and sent to the first order sensory neuron, which is going to come into the spinal cord. And then it's going to synapse onto our second order sensory neuron, where that information may go up the same side or it might cross, and then it's going to be finished and processed at the cerebellum. The cerebellum has several jobs, one of which is the unconscious coordination of skeletal muscle. So if you're going to have graceful coordinated movements, you need to know the position of your body before you take another step. And so it totally makes sense to me, and hopefully to you, that proprioception information will be processed here at the cerebellum. And so we can remember spinocerebellar pathway is carrying proprioception information. This is the only one of our ascending tracts that is going to be processed at the cerebellum. So that's going to be something special here. Remember, it's unconscious, so this is outside of our conscious awareness. So again, this is allowing us to take coordinated movements, or if we've trained our body to do certain movements like dance or play tennis or drive a car or write or walk, then the cerebellum is able to coordinate those movements. Okay, the next one for us to look at is what's called the lateral spinothalamic tract. So here it is named because the tract is positioned in the lateral white column, and also spinothalamic tells us that it comes into the spinal cord and it is processed, it relays through the thalamus, so then that means it's processed at the primary somatosensory cortex. The lateral spinothalamic tract is going to send pain and temperature information to the first order sensory neuron, which is the neuron all the time that's bringing information into the spinal cord. Our first order sensory neuron is going to synapse onto our second order sensory neuron, which then decussates, so crosses over, and then ascends to the thalamus, where it's going to synapse onto the thalamic neuron, or the third order neuron, which will then send that information to the primary somatosensory cortex for processing. And then our last ascending tract is the anterior spinothalamic tract. This one is named because also you have information coming in the spinal cord and then going to the relay center of the thalamus, and here it's positioned in the anterior white column. The anterior spinothalamic tract is very similar to the lateral spinothalamic tract, except you have different type of information traveling. This is our crude touch and pressure information, which is sent to our first order sensory neuron. You should be picking up on the pattern. First order sensory neuron brings that information into the spinal cord, synapses onto our second order sensory neuron, which in this case decussates and ascends up to the thalamus. Second order sensory neuron is going to synapse onto that third order thalamic neuron, which will send that information to be processed at the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, so stay tuned for our descending tracts.